The papacy shimmered with gold and decay, its halls streaked thick with the scent of incense and corruption. In the heart of the Vatican, Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, surveyed his domain with a predator's gaze. The papal tiara weighed heavy on his brow, but it was a burden he bore with relish. For years he had schemed, bribed, and clawed his way to the throne of St. Peter, and now, at last, the Holy See was his. The Borgias were not noble by birth, but they were ruthless by nature. Rodrigo's rise had been fueled by a network of alliances sealed with Spanish gold and whispered promises. Cardinals who opposed him found their influence waning or their lives cut short. The papal court, once a bastion of piety, had become a den of vice where fortunes were won and lost over games of chance and the favors of courtesans. At the center of it all stood Lucrezia, Rodrigo's daughter, a vision of golden hair and porcelain beauty. Just 16, she was already a prize in her father's grand designs. Her laughter echoed through the Vatican's gilded halls, but behind her smile lay the sharp mind of a player in a game she had not chosen. Beside her loomed Cesare, her brother, a young cardinal with the cold eyes of a wolf and ambitions that outstripped even his father's. The whispers began almost immediately. Rome was a city that thrived on scandal, and the Borgias provided ample fodder. Rodrigo's mistresses paraded openly, their bastard children raised within the Vatican's walls. Cesare's violent reputation grew with each enemy who vanished in the night, and Lucrezia, sweet, innocent Lucrezia, was caught in the crossfire of rumor and insinuation. The papal court was a stage, and every player knew their lines, but the script was written in blood. Outside the Vatican's walls, the city seethed. The people murmured of poison in the wine, of daggers in the dark. The Borgia's enemies, the Della Roveres, the Sforzas, circled like vultures, their pamphlets and broadsheets dripping with venom. Rome had seen corruption before, but never so brazen, so personal. And so, beneath the frescoed ceilings of the Apostolic Palace, the seeds of a darker legend took root. The whispers slithered through the shadows. What manner of family was this? What sins lay hidden behind closed doors? The stage was set. The players were ready, and the world would never forget the name Borgia. The first whispers were like smoke, thin, insubstantial, but impossible to ignore. They curled through the taverns of Rome, slipped between the lips of courtiers in the Vatican's antechambers, and seeped into the ink of anonymous pamphlets left in the piazzas at dawn. The daughter shares the father's bed. The brother's gaze lingers too long. No one could say who spoke the words first, but they spread like a plague through the city. The Borgia's enemies needed no proof, only scandal, only something vile enough to erode the family's grip on power. And what was more vile than incest? The pamphlets appeared overnight, crude woodcuts depicting twisted embraces, their figures just vague enough to avoid outright libel, but unmistakable in their intent. Rodrigo's jowled face, Cesare's sharp features, Lucrezia's flowing hair, all rendered in grotesque caricature. The text was worse, verses dripping with innuendo, prayers twisted into obscenity. O Holy Father, who art in bed, unhallowed be thy name. Lucrezia, walking through the Vatican gardens with her ladies, would find them falling silent as she approached, their eyes darting away. Even the servants whispered behind their hands. She was no fool. She knew what they said, but to acknowledge it would be to give the rumors power. Cesare, ever the wolf, reacted differently. He cornered a printer in the dead of night, his dagger pressing into the man's throat until he named his patron, a Sforza lackey, paid to distribute filth. The printer's body was found floating in the Tiber the next morning, his tongue cut out. The message was clear, but the damage was done. Scandal once unleashed could not be so easily sheathed. Rodrigo, for his part, dismissed it all with a wave of his ringed hand. Let the dogs bark, he told Lucrezia, his voice thick with wine. They envy what they cannot have. But his nonchalance only fueled speculation. Why would a pope, God's representative on earth, not rage against such slander? Unless the rumors grew teeth. At a banquet hosted by Cardinal Orsini, a rival faction, A poet recited verses laden with double meaning, his eyes flickering toward Lucretia as he spoke of flowers plucked too soon. The room erupted in stifled laughter. Lucretia, her cheeks burning, kept her chin high. But later, in the privacy of her chambers, she shattered a vase against the wall. Cesare found her there, kneeling among the shards. "They will pay," he promised, his voice a blade unsheathed. But payment was not enough. The whispers had taken root, and in the shadows of Renaissance Rome, where truth and lies were currency, the most dangerous stories were the ones people wanted to believe. Incest was the unforgivable sin, the violation of nature, the corruption of bloodlines, the unraveling of divine order. In a world where the church preached purity and the sanctity of family, no accusation carried more weight. And for the Borgia's enemies, that made it the perfect weapon. Rome had long tolerated the vices of its rulers: bribery, murder, even the open flaunting of mistresses. But incest, that was different. It was a sin so monstrous it could not be spoken aloud in polite company, yet so tantalizing it spread like wildfire in the dark. The Borgias were already reviled for their Spanish blood, their insatiable greed, their brazen nepotism. But the whispers of incest transformed them from mere sinners into something far worse: abominations. And yet, the irony was bitter. The Borgias were guilty, just not of this. Rodrigo had bought the papacy with chests of gold, securing votes from cardinals whose piety dissolved at the sight of Spanish coin. Cesare had ordered assassinations with the casual cruelty of a man who believed himself above earthly justice. Lucrezia's marriages were brokered like trade agreements, her body a bargaining chip in her father's endless games of power. These were sins Rome could understand, even expect, but they were not enough to destroy the family. Not like this rumor could. The pamphlets grew bolder. One, slipped under the door of a Venetian ambassador, depicted Lucretia as a modern-day Phaedra, her arms entwined with both father and brother. Another, read aloud in the taverns of Trastevere, spun a tale of a papal key that unlocked more than just heaven's gates. The Borgia's enemies needed no proof, only the seed of doubt, watered by the public's appetite for scandal. Even the church's own teachings fed the flames. Sermons on morality, on the sins of Sodom, on the damnation that awaited those who defiled sacred bonds, all were twisted into veiled condemnations of the Borgias. A Florentine preacher, his voice trembling with righteous fury, spoke of a house where the serpent nests in the marriage bed. He did not name names. He did not need to. Lucrezia, trapped in the eye of the storm, became both villain and victim. To some, she was the seductress, the temptress who ensnared her own kin. To others, she was the pawn, the innocent corrupted by the men who should have protected her. The truth mattered less than the story, and the story was too delicious to resist. Cesare, ever the strategist, saw the danger. "They paint us as monsters," he snarled to his father, "because they cannot defeat us as rivals." Rodrigo, reclining in his chambers with a goblet of wine, only chuckled. Let them talk. Words are wind. But words, as Cesare knew, could topple empires. The Borgia's real sins, their bribes, their murders, their naked ambition, were mundane beside the myth taking shape, a myth that would outlive them all. For in the end, history remembers not what men do, but what others say they did. And Rome was already writing the Borgia's epitaph in ink stained with poison. Lucrezia Borgia was never merely a daughter. She was a key, a finely wrought golden key to the vaults of power her father, Alexander VI, sought to unlock. From the moment she could walk, she had been groomed for a singular purpose: to serve the Borgia dynasty. But was she a willing participant in her father's machinations, or merely a pawn moved across the chessboard of Renaissance politics? The answer, like so much of her life, lay shrouded in the shadows of the Vatican. Rodrigo Borgia had never been a man to let sentiment interfere with ambition. His love for Lucrezia was real, of that there was little doubt, but it was a love tempered by calculation. She was his most valuable asset, a jewel to be bartered for alliances, lands, and influence. By the age of 13, she had already been betrothed twice, Her hand promised to noblemen whose loyalty could be bought or whose territories could be absorbed into the Borgia web. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro was a cold transaction. The Sforzas were a powerful Milanese family, and the union secured Alexander's northern interests. But when the political winds shifted, so too did Lucrezia's fate. The marriage was dissolved under murky circumstances, Giovanni fleeing Rome in terror, rumors swirling that the annulment hinged on claims of his impotence, or worse, that Alexander had fabricated the entire ordeal to free Lucrezia for a more advantageous match. "You will be a queen," her father had murmured to her when the Sforza marriage crumbled, his fingers brushing her cheek with deceptive tenderness. Not a countess, not a lord's wife, a queen. Lucrezia had bowed her head, her voice steady. "As you wish, Holy Father." But behind the obedient words, what did she truly feel? Some historians would later paint her as a passive ornament, her will bent entirely to her father's. Others would argue she was a keen player in the game, her sweetness a mask for a mind as sharp as any dagger. The truth perhaps lay somewhere in between. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, a prince of Naples, was another piece in Alexander's grand design. Naples was a jewel in the Mediterranean, and with Lucrezia as its future queen, the Borgias would command the south as they did Rome. But this union, too, would end in blood. Alfonso would not live to see his throne, his body left broken in a Roman alley, his killers never named but widely suspected. It was these marriages, these abrupt, brutal shifts in her fate, that fed the darkest whispers. Why would a father so publicly parade his daughter through betrothals and annulments unless there was something unnatural in their bond? The pamphleteers sneered. What groom could satisfy a bride already claimed by her own kin? Lucrezia's ladies reported hearing her weep at night, but by dawn she was always composed, her face a serene mask as she attended Mass at her father's side. Was it resignation, complicity, or the steely resolve of a woman who understood that survival in the Borgia court meant playing the game better than anyone else? Alexander, for his part, seemed untroubled by the rumors. When a cardinal dared to allude to the scandal in a consistory meeting, the Pope's laughter boomed through the hall. "Do you think I would share such a treasure with any man, even my own son?" The jest was calculated, brazen enough to mock the accusation, yet laced with just enough ambiguity to unsettle. In the end, Lucrezia's value to her father was never in question. She was the perfect instrument, beautiful, intelligent, malleable when necessary, ruthless when required. Whether she embraced her role or merely endured it mattered little to Alexander. The Borgias did not deal in love, they dealt in power. And power, as Rome was learning, was a far more dangerous thing than desire. Cesare Borgia moved through Rome like a blade unsheathed, swift, silent, and deadly. Where his father ruled with gold and guile, Cesare preferred steel. His reputation was carved in blood. The cardinal who had cast aside his robes for armor. The Pope's son who commanded armies with the same ease he once recited scripture. But it was his relationship with Lucrezia that truly set tongues wagging. The siblings were inseparable. Cesare, ever the protector, hovered at Lucrezia's side, his presence a silent warning to those who might think to harm or slight her. He escorted her to Mass, lingered at her banquets, and dismissed her suitors with a glance that promised violence. To outsiders, their closeness was unnatural. To the Borgias, it was simply the way of their world. Lucrezia, for her part, seemed to bask in her brother's shadow. Where others saw menace, she saw devotion. "No one understands him as I do," she once confided to a lady-in-waiting, her voice tinged with pride. "He is not the monster they paint him to be." But Rome knew better, or at least it thought it did. The rumors had begun years earlier, when Lucrezia was still a girl. Whispers that Cesare lingered too long in her chambers, that his kisses lingered on her cheek, that his gifts, jewels, silks, a dagger with a pearl handle, were more fitting for a lover than a brother. The truth, as ever, was murkier. Cesare was possessive, yes, but whether his love was fraternal or something darker, none could say for certain. Even history hesitates to draw the line. What was undeniable was Cesare's role in Lucrezia's scandals. When her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza crumbled, it was Cesare who delivered the annulment papers, and Cesare who was rumored to have threatened Giovanni's life if he refused to sign. When her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was found stabbed in an alley, it was Cesare's name that rose to the surface like a corpse in the Tiber. He would kill for her, the courtiers murmured, but would he kill because of her? The question haunted Lucrezia's reputation. Did Cesare eliminate Alfonso out of political necessity or out of jealousy? The timing was damning. Alfonso had been young, handsome, and beloved by Lucrezia in a way none of her previous suitors had been. Their marriage had been one of rare affection, a fleeting glimpse of happiness in the Borgia's cutthroat world. And then, abruptly, it ended in blood. Cesare never confessed, but he never denied it either. When pressed by a drunken nobleman at a banquet, he merely smiled, swirling his wine. A man who cannot keep what is his does not deserve to keep it. The nobleman did not speak again that night. Lucrezia's grief was public, her tears genuine. But within weeks she was back at her father's side, her mourning clothes exchanged for silks, her face a mask of composure. Some said she had forgiven Cesare, others whispered she had known all along. The siblings' bond only deepened in the aftermath. Cesare, ever the strategist, ensured Lucrezia's next marriage would be to a man of his choosing. Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, a match that would secure the Borgia legacy in the north. And Lucrezia, ever the dutiful daughter, acquiesced. But Rome never forgot. The rumors festered, fed by Cesare's ruthless reputation and Lucrezia's enigmatic silence. Had they been partners in crime? Had their bond crossed the line from loyalty into something unspeakable? The truth, like so much of the Borgia's lives, was buried beneath layers of power, propaganda, and poison. But one thing was certain. In the shadow of Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia was both protected and imprisoned, a queen on a chessboard, where every move was dictated by blood. And blood, as the Borgias knew better than anyone, was the one thing that never washed clean. The banquet hall glittered like a gilded cage. Candles dripped wax onto silver platters, their flames casting long, flickering shadows across the frescoed walls. Pope Alexander VI sat at the head of the table, his laughter booming as he raised a jeweled goblet to his lips. Around him, Rome's most powerful men feasted, cardinals in their crimson silks, nobles with their rings flashing, all of them unaware that they were players in a deadly game. This was the Borgia table, and not all who dined would leave alive. Lucrezia, draped in emerald velvet, presided over the feast with practiced grace. Her fingers brushed the stem of her wineglass, her lips curved in a smile that never reached her eyes. Beside her, Cesare lounged like a panther, his gaze as sharp as it swept the room. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, and something else, something acrid beneath the perfume. The first to falter was Cardinal Orsini, his face, already flushed from wine, turned ashen. He clutched his stomach, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I feel unwell," he muttered, but his words were lost in the din of laughter. By the time his body hit the floor, convulsing, the servants were already moving forward, not to help, but to discreetly drag him away. The music played on. One by one, others began to sway. A young lord retched into his plate. A bishop clawed at his throat, his eyes bulging. The poison worked swiftly, a silent assassin in the wine, the bread, the sugared fruits. Some said it was Cantarella, the Borgia's signature brew, a concoction so refined it left no trace, only corpses. Lucrezia watched it all, her expression serene. When Cesare leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, she did not flinch. "They should not have crossed us," he murmured. She sipped her wine. "No," she replied. "They should not have." By dawn, 6 men were dead. The official story would blame bad shellfish, a tragic accident. But Rome knew better. The whispers spread like wildfire. The Borgias had purged their enemies in plain sight, feasting as their guests choked on their last breaths. It was not the first such banquet, nor would it be the last. These poisoned feasts became legend, reinforcing the family's monstrous image. What kind of people murdered under the guise of hospitality? What kind of daughter sat calmly as men died at her table? The answer was simple. The Borgias were not like other people. They played by their own rules, and woe to those who forgot it. As the bodies were carried away, Alexander raised his glass once more, his smile genial. "To health," he toasted. And the survivors, trembling, drank. The wedding had been a spectacle of silk and gold, a display of Borgia power meant to dazzle Rome. Lucrezia, barely 13, had stood before the altar in a gown of Venetian lace, her small hands clasped in those of Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. The groom, twice her age, had smiled with the confidence of a man who believed himself favored by fortune. He did not yet know his marriage was a transaction, one that would end as abruptly as it began, and in whispers darker than the Tiber at midnight. The feast that followed was lavish even by Borgia standards. Wine flowed in rivers, and the tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks, their feathers reattached in grotesque splendor. Lucrezia, her face a mask of practiced serenity, accepted toasts from men who eyed her like a prize. Across the hall, her father and brother watched, their expressions unreadable. When the time came for the bedding ceremony, the guests erupted into bawdy cheers. Tradition demanded the bride be escorted to the marital chamber, where the marriage would be consummated under the gaze of witnesses, proof of its legitimacy. But as the crowd surged forward, Alexander raised a hand. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "My daughter is a child still. Let them retire in peace." The room fell silent. It was a breach of custom, a refusal to let Rome see the marriage sealed. Giovanni's face darkened, but he dared not protest. Lucrezia was led away by her ladies, her steps measured, her eyes downcast. Behind closed doors, the truth of what transpired, or did not, would become the subject of fevered speculation. Giovanni would later claim the marriage was consummated. Lucrezia, in the annulment proceedings, would insist it was not. But the annulment itself was a masterpiece of Borgia cunning. Alexander, needing to sever ties with the Sforzas as Milan's political winds shifted, declared the marriage void on grounds of non-consummation, a humiliation for Giovanni, who was forced to sign a document attesting to his own impotence. "No man would admit such a thing willingly," Giovanni snarled to his allies after fleeing Rome. "They threatened me. The Pope's own son held a knife to my throat." The rumors took flight. Had Giovanni been impotent as the Borgias claimed, or had something far more sinister prevented the marriage's consummation? Whispers slithered through the streets. Had Lucrezia's father or brother intervened? Had she been kept untouched for darker purposes? The Vatican's official stance was firm. The marriage was invalid, and Lucrezia was free to wed again for the good of the Church. But Rome was not so easily convinced. The annulment reeked of political maneuvering, or worse, of secrets too vile to name. Lucrezia, for her part, said nothing. She withdrew to the convent of San Sisto, her sudden piety raising eyebrows. Was it grief, shame, or a strategic retreat, allowing the scandal to cool before her next role in her father's ambitions? Giovanni, stripped of his bride and his pride, would spend years railing against the Borgias, his fury fueling the rumors. "They are monsters," he wrote to a fellow noble. "What kind of father annuls his daughter's marriage on such grounds, unless he has other uses for her?" The question lingered, unanswered. For Lucrezia, the first wedding night was not a beginning but a prelude, a taste of the betrayals and intrigues that would define her life. And for Rome, it was proof that in the house of Borgia, even love was a weapon. The convent of San Sisto was a world away from the gilded halls of the Vatican. Its high stone walls muffled the clamor of Rome, and the scent of incense and damp parchment replaced the perfumed decadence of the papal court. Here, Lucrezia Borgia sought refuge, or at least the appearance of it. Her arrival had been swift and unannounced. Dressed in simple wool, her golden hair hidden beneath a veil, she had slipped through the convent's gates like a ghost. The abbess, a stern woman with eyes like flint, had welcomed her with wary reverence. This was the Pope's daughter, after all. A sinner or a saint, the abbess did not dare to guess. The whispers followed her, even here. Behind the convent's cloistered walls, the nuns spoke in hushed tones of the scandal that had driven Lucrezia into their midst. Some pitied her, a child bride cast aside by her husband, abandoned by her family. Others eyed her with suspicion. Why would a girl of her station retreat to such austerity unless she carried a secret too heavy for the world to bear? The rumor took root like a weed. Lucrezia was with child. It spread through the convent's corridors, carried on the lips of novices who stole glances at her waist. Was it Giovanni Sforza's, conceived in that brief, contested marriage? Or was it something darker, a child of sin, its origins too vile to name? The pamphlets circulating Rome had already painted her as a temptress, a daughter who shared her father's bed. Now, her sudden withdrawal only fueled the fire. Lucrezia said nothing. She attended Mass with bowed head, her fingers tight around her rosary. She knelt for hours in the chapel, her lips moving in silent prayer. But the nuns noticed how her hand sometimes trembled, how her breath hitched when the bells tolled. Cesare came once, cloaked and unannounced. The abbess nearly fainted when he strode into the courtyard, his boots scattering gravel. He and Lucrezia spoke in low, urgent tones near the herb garden, their faces close. When he left, his expression was thunderous. The next morning a physician arrived, a discreet man with no ties to the Vatican. He examined Lucrezia behind locked doors. The nuns pressed their ears to the wood but heard nothing. When he emerged, his face was unreadable. The truth, whatever it was, remained hidden. But Rome's gossips needed no proof. The story took on a life of its own. Lucrezia, the poisoned flower, had been sent away to hide her shame. Some said she bore a child in secret, a babe spirited away to the countryside. Others claimed she had taken herbs to purge her womb, her sins washed clean with blood. Alexander VI, when pressed by his cardinals, laughed off the rumors. "My daughter is pious," he declared. "She seeks solace in God's grace. Would you deny her that?" Yet even his allies exchanged glances. The timing was too convenient, the whispers too loud. Lucrezia remained at San Sisto for months, her absence from court a void filled with speculation. When she finally returned to the Vatican, she was paler, thinner, but her gaze was steady. The rumors had not broken her. If anything, they had hardened her. Her enemies watched, waiting for a misstep. But Lucrezia had learned the most valuable lesson of all. In the Borgia's world, survival was not about innocence or guilt. It was about control. And so she stepped back into the light, her head high, her secrets buried deep. Let Rome whisper. She would outlast them all. The streets of Rome were slick with rain the night Alfonso of Aragon died. Lucrezia had wept when they brought her the news. Her second husband, handsome, gentle Alfonso, the only man she had ever dared to love, lay broken in the mud of an alleyway, his body pierced by assassins' blades. The killers had vanished like shadows, leaving behind only blood and the echo of hurried footsteps. The city held its breath. Everyone knew who stood to gain from Alfonso's death. The Aragonese alliance had soured. Naples was no longer useful to Alexander VI's ambitions. And Cesare Borgia, ever the serpent in the garden, had made no secret of his disdain for his brother-in-law. Lucrezia, cloaked in black, knelt beside her husband's corpse in the dim light of the chapel. His face was still beautiful in death, the violence of his end at odds with the peace that had settled over his features. She pressed a kiss to his cold forehead, her tears falling onto his still chest. "Who did this?" she whispered. The guards shifted uneasily. No one answered. But Rome already had its verdict. Cesare arrived at dawn, his boots tracking mud across the chapel floor. He stood over Alfonso's body, his expression unreadable. Lucrezia did not look up. "You mourn too loudly," he said at last, his voice low. "The Aragonese will use your grief as a weapon." Her hands, clenched in her lap, trembled. "Did you do it?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Cesare exhaled through his nose, a sound almost like regret. "He was a threat. You know this." Lucrezia's breath hitched. Alfonso had been many things, a prince of Naples, a pawn in her father's games. But he had never been a threat to her. He had brought her music, poetry, fleeting moments of tenderness in a world that demanded steel. And now, he was gone. Cesare reached for her, but she recoiled. His jaw tightened. "The world is not kind to women who love too freely," he said coldly. "I spared you the pain of learning that lesson too late." The words were a knife twisted in her ribs. Outside the chapel, the whispers had already begun. The Borgias had murdered their own, not for the first time and not for the last. But this death was different. This was no cardinal who had outlived his usefulness, no rival who had crossed the family. This was Lucrezia's husband, her heart. And if Cesare could do this, what else was he capable of? The rumors exploded like gunpowder. Pamphlets circulated within hours, their ink still wet, depicting Cesare as Cain and Lucrezia as a weeping Abel. The Borgia's enemies seized on the moment, their voices dripping with mock sympathy. What kind of brother kills his sister's love unless that love was his to claim all along? Lucrezia's grief was public, but her rage was private. She withdrew to her chambers, refusing all visitors, even her father, who sent conciliatory gifts of jewels and perfumes that she left untouched. For the first time in her life, the beautiful daughter had been betrayed, and Rome would never let her forget it. Alfonso's murder became the linchpin of the Borgia mythos, proof that no one, not even family, was safe from their treachery. The whispers of incest, once dismissed as slander, now took on a sinister weight. Why else would Cesare eliminate a rival for Lucrezia's affections? Why else would a pope allow his son to slaughter his daughter's husband? The answers, real or imagined, painted a picture too monstrous to ignore. Cesare, ever pragmatic, seemed indifferent to the uproar. When a Spanish envoy dared to question him, he smiled and offered the man a glass of wine. "Accidents happen," he said lightly. The envoy declined the drink. Lucrezia, meanwhile, became a ghost in her own palace. Her ladies reported hearing her weep at night, but by day she was a statue, beautiful and untouchable, her emotions locked away where no one could see them. Only once did she break her silence. At a private mass for Alfonso's soul, she turned to her brother, her voice barely audible. "You took him from me." Cesare's gaze did not waver. "I protected you." She laughed then, a sound like shattering glass. "No, you only proved what they all say about us." And with that, she walked away, leaving him standing in the candlelight, the architect of his own damnation. Alfonso's blood had sealed the Borgia's fate. From that night forward, the world would see them not just as corrupt, not just as ruthless, but as something far worse, a family that devoured its own. And Lucrezia, the eternal pawn, had learned the hardest lesson of all. In the house of Borgia, even love was a death sentence. The Vatican's corridors whispered with the rustle of silk and the scent of perfume long after Vespers. Pope Alexander VI, God's chosen vicar on earth, held court by day in sacred vestments, but by night the robes slipped away, revealing a man of earthly appetites. His mistresses moved through the apostolic palace like shadows, their laughter echoing where hymns should have reigned. Julia Farnese, called La Bella for the golden hair that tumbled down her back, was the most infamous. Barely 16 when she caught the Pope's eye, she became his acknowledged concubine. Her likeness painted as the Virgin Mary in Vatican frescoes, a blasphemy that made even jaded cardinals blanch. Then there was Vannozza de Catanei, mother of his 4 eldest children, her influence lingering like smoke long after their affair cooled. And others, whose names history barely recorded, fleeting figures in the papal bed. Rome had tolerated popes with mistresses before, but Alexander flaunted his sins. He hosted banquets where his lovers dined beside bishops, their jewels glinting in the candlelight. He bestowed titles and lands upon his bastards, seating them above princes of the church. His daughter Lucrezia, born of Vannozza, was groomed for dynastic marriages, while his son Cesare, once a cardinal, cast aside his robes to become a warlord. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. He preaches chastity from the pulpit and practices debauchery in his chambers, a Venetian envoy wrote home, sealing the letter with wax before the Borgia spies could intercept it. The Pope's enemies needed no further ammunition. If Alexander could so openly defy the vows of celibacy, what other sacred lines would he cross? The whispers slithered from the taverns to the conclaves. A man who keeps mistresses might keep his daughter as one. The incest rumor, once outrageous, now found fertile ground. Even his own courtiers grew uneasy. Cardinal Sforza, no stranger to vice himself, crossed himself when he saw Giulia Farnese perched on the arm of the papal throne. "God sees," he muttered to a colleague. "God forgives," came the wry reply. "But the people do not." Alexander seemed not to care. He doted on his children, legitimate or not, with a pride that bordered on idolatry. When Lucrezia turned 16, he gifted her a palace of her own. Its walls hung with tapestries of nymphs and satyrs. When Cesare demanded command of the papal armies, Alexander dissolved his cardinalate with a wave of his hand. The message was clear. Blood came before God. The mistresses, for their part, played their roles with cunning. Giulia, ever the survivor, curried favor with Lucrezia, binding the girl to her with gifts and whispered confidences. Vanozza, though set aside, remained a power in Rome's underworld, her inns and brothels humming with secrets. They knew their worth to Alexander, and they knew the price of falling from grace. But it was Lucretia who paid the highest price. Every time her father paraded a new lover, every time he kissed Giulia's hand in public, or let his fingers linger too long on a serving girl's waist, the rumors about her gained credence. If the Pope had no shame, what boundaries remained? The final outrage came when Alexander, in a fit of paternal largesse, hosted a ball to celebrate the birth of another bastard, this one by a woman so young the guests averted their eyes. That night, as wine flowed and dancers swirled, a Spanish bishop dared to approach the papal throne. "Holiness," he ventured, "is this seemly?" Alexander, his arm around Giulia's waist, laughed until his jowls shook. "Seemly?" He raised his cup. "We are all God's children, are we not?" The bishop retreated, his face ashen. Within weeks, the story spread to every corner of Europe, embellished with each telling. By the time it reached Paris, the ball had become an orgy, the infant a demon, and Lucrezia, always Lucrezia, the willing participant in her father's sins. Alexander's mistresses were not the crime. The crime was his brazenness, his utter disregard for the pretense of piety. In a world where power relied on perception, he had torn away the veil, and in doing so, made every vile rumor about his family seem possible. For why would a man who defied God's laws stop at the taboo of incest? As Giulia Farnese once quipped to a lover, her voice dripping with honeyed malice, "When the Pope plays the devil, who's to say where the performance ends?" The question haunted Lucrezia's steps, and Rome, ever eager for scandal, already knew its answer. The summer of 1503 was stifling, the air thick with the stench of the Tiber's sluggish waters and the sweat of a city on edge. Rome simmered under the weight of its own corruption, and at its heart, Pope Alexander VI, once untouchable, now moved like a man haunted. His jowls sagged, his hands trembled, and his laughter, once a booming force that shook the Vatican's halls, had dulled to a rasp. On the evening of August 18th, Alexander dined with Cardinal Adriano de Corneto at a villa outside the city walls. The meal was lavish, as all Borgia gatherings were. Roasted pheasant, figs dripping with honey, wine from the Pope's private cellars. But as the night wore on, the guests noticed something amiss. The Pope, usually a glutton for both food and conversation, picked at his plate, his face ashen. "Holiness, are you unwell?" Corneto ventured. Alexander waved a dismissive hand. "A trifle. The heat, perhaps." But by midnight he was writhing in agony. Servants carried him back to the Vatican, his robes drenched in sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Physicians were summoned, their diagnoses whispered behind cupped hands. Some spoke of a tertiary fever, others of a surfeit of rich food. But Rome, ever suspicious, had another theory. Poison. The rumors spread like wildfire. Had the Della Roveres finally succeeded where their armies had failed? Had the Sforzas, still seething over Lucrezia's annulled marriage, slipped venom into the papal wine? Or more chillingly, had God himself delivered divine retribution upon a man who had defied every sacred law? Cesare, returning from a campaign in the Romagna, found his father's chambers in chaos. The once mighty pope lay shrunken beneath silk sheets, his skin mottled, his eyes darting in delirium. At his bedside, Lucrezia clutched a vial of holy water, her lips moving in silent prayer. "Who did this?" Cesare demanded, his voice a blade. The physicians exchanged glances. Nature, perhaps. Or. The symptoms resemble cantarella. The word hung in the air like a curse. Cantarella, the Borgia's own weapon, the poison rumored to leave no trace. The irony was bitter. Had Alexander fallen to his own methods? Cesare's face darkened. He turned to his sister. Who was with him last? Lucrezia's hands trembled. Cornetto. But surely, Cornetto. Cesare spat the name like venom. A Della Rovere pawn. But even as he spoke, doubt flickered in his eyes. Poison was a woman's weapon, some said. Had a spurned mistress sought vengeance? A cuckolded husband? Or was this the work of a far closer hand? Alexander's final hours were a grotesque spectacle. He raved of demons, of flames licking at his feet. At times he called for Lucrezia, his voice cracking with something akin to fear. "Daughter, forgive me." Other times he lashed out, hurling curses at shadows only he could see. On the third day, as the sun set in a blaze of scarlet, the Pope's breath stilled. Silence fell over the Vatican. Then, from the streets below, a sound began. First a murmur, then a roar. The people of Rome, long oppressed by Borgia rule, took to the piazzas, their voices rising in a cacophony of grief, relief, and sheer disbelief. The Pope was dead. The reign of terror was over, or so they thought. In the apostolic palace, Cesare stood over his father's corpse, his face unreadable. Lucrezia, her cheeks streaked with tears, reached for his hand. He did not take it. "This changes nothing," he said softly. "We are still Borgias." But outside, the wolves were already circling. The Della Rovere, the Sforza, the Orsini. All saw their chance. The papal throne was vacant, and with it, the Borgia's power hung by a thread. And as the first stones were hurled at the Vatican's gates, one question burned hotter than the August sun. Had Alexander's death been murder, or the hand of a wrathful god? Rome would never agree on the answer. But one thing was certain. The Borgia era was ending, and it would end in blood. Without Alexander's iron grip on the papacy, Rome turned on the Borgias like a pack of starving wolves. Cesare, once the invincible prince of the Church's armies, found himself adrift. His father's death had severed the strings of his power, and the new pope, Pius III, lasted only weeks before the Della Rovere faction secured the throne for Julius II, their longtime enemy. The Borgia's golden age was over. Cesare fled Rome under cover of night, his armor traded for the garb of a merchant, his infamous swagger reduced to the hurried steps of a fugitive. But even in exile, his name carried too much weight. Captured in Naples by Gonzalo de Cordoba, the Spanish general who had once been his ally, Cesare was thrown into a dungeon, his destiny no longer his own. The news reached Lucrezia in Ferrara, where she had rebuilt her life as the Duchess d'Este. The letter trembled in her hands as she read of her brother's imprisonment, first in Spain, then in the bleak fortress of La Mota. The man who had once commanded armies now rotted in a cell, his enemies savoring his downfall. "He will not last the winter," her informant wrote. "The Spanish king has no love for traitors." Lucrezia did not weep. She had shed too many tears for the Borgias already. Instead, she folded the letter and tucked it into the folds of her gown, her face a mask of ducal composure. But in the privacy of her chambers, she pressed her forehead against the cold stone of the windowsill and whispered a name she had not spoken in years. Cesare. His end came swiftly. In 1507, barely 4 years after their father's death, Cesare Borgia died in a skirmish in Navarre, cut down not by a rival general, but by a nameless soldier's spear. The man who had once been the terror of Italy fell ignobly, his body left to the crows. When word reached Ferrara, Lucrezia ordered a mass for his soul. She knelt in the cathedral, her black veil hiding her face, her lips moving in silent prayer. The courtiers whispered. Was she mourning the brother who had loved her too fiercely, or the monster who had destroyed so much? Perhaps both. For Lucrezia, Cesare's death was the final severing of her past. With him gone, the last living tether to the Borgia name was cut. No longer the Pope's daughter, no longer the warlord's sister, she was free, if such a thing were possible, to be only herself. Lucrezia d'Este, Duchess of Ferrara, a woman who had outlived the legends. But the scars remained. In the quiet hours of the night, she sometimes dreamed of Rome, of golden halls and poisoned feasts, of a brother's possessive grip and a father's calculating smile. She would wake, gasping, her fingers clutching the sheets, the echoes of their voices still ringing in her ears. Yet by dawn, she was always composed. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. Survival was not about escaping the past. It was about burying it so deep that no one, not even she, could hear its whispers. And so she lived, not as a Borgia, but as something else entirely, a woman who had survived them. Ferrara, 1510. The ducal palace rose like a fortress of marble and light, its gardens fragrant with orange blossoms and the murmur of fountains. Here, far from the poisoned intrigues of Rome, Lucrezia Borgia, now Lucrezia d'Este, walked the sunlit corridors as a woman reborn. Her third marriage had been her salvation. Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, was no lovesick poet like her ill-fated Alfonso of Aragon, nor a pawn like Giovanni Sforza. He was a ruler in his own right, pragmatic and unshaken by the whispers that trailed his bride. When he had first met Lucrezia, his gaze had been assessing, not leering. I care little for gossip, he had told her plainly, only for loyalty. And so, Lucrezia had vowed to be loyal. She threw herself into her new role with a fervor that surprised even her. No longer the passive ornament of the Vatican, she became Ferrara's beating heart, patron of poets, protector of the arts, a mother to her growing brood of d'Este children. The people, wary at first of the infamous Borgia daughter, soon whispered of her kindness, how she fed the poor during famine, how she knelt in the cathedral for hours, her devotion unfeigned. But redemption was never so simple. The past clung to her like a shadow. When she hosted masquerades, guests still murmured behind their masks. Did she poison her rivals? Did she bed her brother? The pamphlets followed her, smuggled into Ferrara by merchants, their ink staining her new life with old sins. Even her ladies, though outwardly devoted, sometimes flinched when she reached for their hands. One evening, as she walked the palace gardens with her youngest son cradled in her arms, her husband joined her, his boots crunching on the gravel. They still talk, Alfonso said without preamble, his voice low. Lucrezia did not pretend to misunderstand. They always will. Does it trouble you? She looked down at her son, his face innocent of the world's cruelties. Once, it would have. Now, she exhaled, watching a petal drift from a blooming rose. Let them whisper. I know who I am. Alfonso studied her, his expression unreadable. You are my wife, the mother of my heirs. That is all that matters. But Lucrezia knew better. The Borgia name could not be so easily shed. Cesare's ghost haunted her still. News of his death had come like a thunderclap, a brutal end for a brutal man. She had mourned him in secret, lighting candles in a private chapel where no one could see her tears. The brother who had loved and betrayed her, who had shaped her destiny as surely as her father had, was gone. And with him, the last living witness to the girl she had once been. Yet even in Ferrara the rumors found her. When a traveling friar preached in the piazza of the scarlet woman whose sins could never be washed clean, the crowd's eyes flicked toward the palace. Alfonso had the man expelled, but the damage was done. Lucrezia's greatest battle was not for power but for memory. She could not rewrite the past, but she could shape the future. She commissioned portraits that showed her as the pious duchess, the devoted mother. She endowed convents, her name etched into the stone of charitable foundations. She made certain that history would remember her as more than a Borgia, And yet, on the anniversary of her father's death, she stood alone in her chambers, a goblet of wine in hand. The years had softened her features, but not the weight in her eyes. She lifted the cup in a silent toast, her whisper barely audible. To the house of Borgia, may its curses die with me. Outside, the bells of Ferrara rang, their peals clean and bright. The world moved on. But Lucrezia would always wonder, had she escaped the curse, or was she simply its last, lonely keeper? The answer, like her legacy, was not hers to decide. The Borgia myth endures not because it is true, but because it is irresistible. Centuries have passed since Lucrezia took her last breath in Ferrara, since Cesare's blood soaked the soil of Navarre, since Alexander VI's corpse was laid to rest in a tomb that would later be desecrated by his enemies. Yet the whispers persist. The rumors of incest, poison, and unspeakable sins cling to their name like a shadow that no amount of historical scrutiny can dispel. Why? The answer lies in the nature of power and the stories we tell to make sense of it. The Borgias were guilty of much: bribery, murder, nepotism, betrayal. But these were the ordinary crimes of Renaissance politics, the currency of every ruling house from Florence to Venice. What made the Borgias unique was their audacity. They flaunted their sins in an age that demanded hypocrisy. Alexander VI kept mistresses openly, seated his bastard children alongside princes, and turned the Vatican into a theater of excess. Cesare abandoned his cardinal's robes for a conqueror's armor, his ambition as naked as his blade. And Lucrezia, beautiful, enigmatic Lucrezia, played the game with a grace that made her complicity seem all the more damning. Their real crimes were monstrous enough, but reality is often less satisfying than myth. The incest rumor endured because it was the perfect slander, unprovable, unforgettable, and utterly corrosive. In a world where the church preached morality while practicing corruption, the idea of a pope bedding his own daughter was the ultimate indictment of hypocrisy. It reduced the Borgias' complex machinations to something primal, something that bypassed reason and lodged in the collective imagination like a barbed hook. And perhaps on some level, people wanted to believe it. The Borgias represented the darkest fantasies of power unchecked. They were the monsters lurking behind the gilded facade of the Renaissance, proof that even God's chosen could be demons in disguise. Their legend served as a warning and a perverse thrill. To paint them as sinners was mundane. To paint them as abominations was unforgettable. Lucrezia in particular became a canvas for every fear and fascination of her age. Was she a victim or a villain? A pawn or a player? The truth, as always, was murkier than the myth. She was a woman navigating a world that offered her no good choices, her agency circumscribed by the men who controlled her fate. But history prefers its women to be either saints or whores, and Lucrezia's complexity was too inconvenient for such neat categorization. The Borgia myth says less about them than it does about us. It reveals our hunger for stories that confirm our deepest suspicions, that power corrupts absolutely, that beauty masks depravity, that the institutions we rely on are as rotten as the people who lead them. The Borgias did not invent these truths. They merely embodied them with a flair that ensured their infamy. And so the lies outlive the truth. The pamphlets of Renaissance Rome have become the history books of today, their ink faded but their poison undimmed. We still speak of Lucrezia's alleged crimes, of Cesare's monstrous appetites, of Alexander's unholy lusts. We do so because the alternative, to accept that they were merely human, flawed, and ruthless in ordinary ways, is somehow less satisfying. In the end, the Borgias' true legacy is not the crimes they committed, but the stories we refuse to let die. And perhaps that was their greatest sin of all.